Welcome back, everybody. We've got an interesting concept today of a guy coming in. Never heard of him before to the candidate race of the 2020. He is Andrew Yang. And when people were telling me about him, I wasn't too excited because we've got like 20 people now in the candidate field for the primaries of the Democratic DNC. He has, I don't know, not a lot of backing, obviously, since this is kind of the first I've heard of him, and pretty minimal traction. But he's an exciting candidate for a couple of different reasons, and the one I want to talk to you guys about today is concerning his webpage and the positions that he's put out for himself. So most candidates, when they come out, they'll state like very broad positions. They won't really give much of an explanation for it. If they say what they'll do about it, they'll give kind of this vague explanation. Not a lot of information. They kind of want to leave it up to your imagination, and the reason for this is pretty obvious. They want to make themselves as appealing as possible to their constituents, and once they start getting into the nitty-gritty details of how they're going to do it or achieve it, they open themselves up for criticism. So kind of the political strategy since the early 1990s has been to talk about what you're going to do but leave the details out of it. And if people try to pin you down on it or interview you and back you into a corner on how you're going to accomplish it, give a vague answer or a resort to a platitude. And Andrew Yang is actually kind of interesting because he's taking the exact opposite approach. And what I want to show you guys is his website here. So this is Andrew Yang 2020, and if you go down to the policy aspect of it, it'll take you to his webpage. Just scroll down. And he has all of these different positions in which he articulates the problem, he articulates his response, and then he tells you exactly what he's going to do about it. So this is a Freedom Divided. This is on universal health care, or I'm sorry, this one was on universal basic income. And he articulates that he would implement this universal basic income, that they give this much every month for people over this age, and that the reasons that we do this is it's going to help the economy and help the people in the future and give everybody a basic subsistence, similar to pretty much any argument you've ever heard for universal basic income. He wants to change to Freedom Divided would require a constitutional amendment, so he kind of articulates the barriers to this. It would be illegal to borrow or lend against this dividend, requiring additional laws in the setup of this. He talks about how much this would cost, who it would affect, and then what I really like is if you have more questions about this, he gives this link, which is, again, back to his own website, but it has an FAQ on it, frequently asked questions, and you can click down on any of the objections you'd have, and he expands just a little bit about those issues. He does some citation in some of them, some more than others, but anyways, it's a well-articulated, well-thought-out argument for his position, and I really like that. Even if I disagree with his argument, the fact that he's willing to cite those, lay out the facts as he sees them, I have to respect that going forward from here. So most of the citation links to pretty reliable websites, just giving out the numbers and the base facts to help support his conclusions. So then he has the problems to be resolved section. These are kind of the things that he sees as barriers in order to overcome, and then he lays out his goals and what he desires to accomplish, and then how he as president will implement actions in order to try to accomplish these goals. So basic universal income, I think, is a pretty terrible idea. You listen to people like Ben Shapiro and Crowder articulate ideas on this. If you're into the pop culture of things, if you want to hear a really in-depth explanation, you can go back to Milton Friedman, who basically laid out the economic principles behind it and why they're bunk. If you want a historical argument against it, you can look back to the Soviet Union and others as far as like their ideals of communism, which is essentially what this harkens back to. And the utter failures that those were across the multiple nations in which it was tried. You can also look at the research articles that have been used on this. Most recently, I think it was Norway who concluded their study early because it was so disastrous and so obviously ineffective. I believe that New Zealand, Australia, and Canada have also run similar attempted trials. I don't know if France is one of those countries as well, but it has been tried in multiple different places under small study pilot programs, none of which have been effective. So I really disagree with the position that he has, but nevertheless, I do respect the fact that he at least attempts to come to the table with an argument and a supported reason for his opinions. So we'll kind of go through some of these other ones. Combat climate change. So this is a hot button topic, especially for the left and particularly the regressive left. You've got a climate change and an existential threat to humanity and our way of life. It should be a top priority of the federal government to implement the policies to control anthropologic climate change while working with other governments to implement these policies throughout the world. It's important to regulate fossil fuels both in control climate change and improve the health of the average American. Now, I do believe this part of it, as far as improving the health of the average American, I think that it's important to have clean air, clean water, basic environment in your society in order to promote health. When we look back over history, even in London during the Industrial Revolution and the smog epidemics that they would have, cutting short life by 15, 20 years. You look at San Francisco during the modernization of America and the smog that they dealt with, even up until this day, air quality remains a problem just because of the geographic location of the bay in which they reside. All of those are terrible problems. You look at the pollution of the Great Lakes, you look at the things that we're seeing as far as species extinction at just record rates that are extremely alarming. These are all things that we have to work at as far as trying to minimize the effects that it has on humanity. And, I disagree, though, that man is the primary motivating control for this to the extent in which climate, what I would term alarmists, are claiming. I nevertheless recognize that there are some significant changes that we need to try to hedge our bets, so to speak, against, and try to preserve the environment as best we can moving forward. So how we go about doing that, I don't think will necessarily be a government-involved solution, but I do believe government has a role to play. So, and he acknowledges this, that while the role of the government is important, much of the work is to be done at state or even neighborly level. So, again, I don't necessarily expect very much from him on this, but he goes, I think, beyond the scope of what is desirable for the government to play a role in. So he says that the problems that are to be tackled include the energy bills that make up a substantial portion of the average American's expense. Americans are suffering from high rates of asthma, emphysema, COPD, and respiratory disease, and pollution and burning fossil fuels. Now, what I would like to see him say from this is a reliance on nuclear energy, and because that would solve all of these problems. Nuclear power plants are extraordinarily clean on the environment for the most part, just depending on how you handle the waste, which has typically been the problem in America because of the hot button issue. People hear nuclear energy and they freak out thinking nuclear weapons and the disastrous radiation that occurs from that. But overall, it's by far the most effective and healthy for the environment and cheapest as far as production of energy. So it's really unfortunate that people are not more educated on that. People want to do more combat climate change, but don't know how. They can't afford the high startup costs of going solar, which is also extremely ineffective, or extremely inefficient, I should say. Burning fossil fuels indiscriminately for over a century has done damage to the environment. No, the research really isn't there to back that up. So I'm trying to remember the guy who presents on that. I want to say it's Andrew Lerinsky, but that might not be his name. Anyways, he does a great documentation series on this. He's an independent researcher who studied this in his entire life and basically concludes that blaming fossil fuels is basically bunk. We are not truly addressing global warming and rising sea levels, only slowing the rate of change. Okay, so make it easier for Americans to contribute to solutions of the climate. Okay, that doesn't really mean anything. Make a magic rainbow to make it easier. I mean, that's essentially what he's saying. Bring down a household electric bill, coordinate community efforts to successful climate change, invest in innovations towards reversing the effects of climate change. All right, so these are all the goals. How do we get there? Guiding principles are innovation and coordination. Okay, words. As president, I will invest heavily in carbon capture and geoengineering technologies. Those are actually pretty promising technologies. They're interesting. I'd like to hear more about them, but thus far untested, unproduced, unproven, let's say. Designed to reverse the damage already done to the environment through new global geoengineering institute and invite international participation. I'd much rather see the evidence actually come out that they work and then talk about supporting them. Invest any idea that has potential to reverse the damage done to the environment. For example, cloud seeding technology to increase the atmospheric reflectivity. I think he's talking about chemtrails there. So this idea harkens back I think in the 1960s when the government came out with dry ice drops in order to particulate clouds over cities or farmland and cause rain. And the idea is to, from a climate change idea, as I understand it, is to particulate clouds and then use the clouds to reflect geothermal energy from the sun off of the planet, reflecting back up into the atmosphere. So I believe that this stems out of the conspiracy theories, or related at least to conspiracy theories involving chemtrails, which go beyond that as far as the effect of those chemtrails on human health. And not saying I believe chemtrails, I think they're bunk, but it's kind of interesting to see that idea come up here. And the current tax benefits given to fossil fuel companies, yes, I completely agree with that. I understand that the idea behind it was try to subsidize American independent oil companies so that we wouldn't be as reliant on OPEC, but it goes against the ideals of the free market. I'm totally in favor of ending those incentives, but we should end all incentives within the economy. We should have a free, open market economy and should not rely on government initiatives and subsidies in order to support areas of the economy that can't support themselves. And research of respiratory diseases that are a direct result of these emissions. Empowering, it's questionable. I don't know. I think the CDC has done a pretty good job of that. I don't really see much reason for why they need additional support or funding in order to continue the work they're already doing. Empowering and appointing action-oriented leaders of the EPA and direct EPA regulation currently. No, the EPA has done a abysmal job, from however you look at it, of regulating the environment. If you are a pro-conservative of the environment and you want to see it protected and kept safe, the EPA has not done a great job of that throughout its history. And if you are anti-EPA for the effects of regulation that it has on industry and the economy, you could also agree that the EPA is detrimental overall for those effects. They usually end up just becoming a money time suck for the economy, in the fact that businesses have to go through it in order to subsidize meaningless reports on how their company will affect the environment, and it's a huge delay. It's a lot of paperwork, it's a lot of red tape, and doesn't usually end up having anything that's good. I think that there are a few companies whose effects have detrimental effects on the economy, but those are few and far between and should have minimal government restrictions as far as how they act. Obviously, we can't have people dumping chemicals into water streams or land reserves willy-nilly, but at the same time, I don't think that the government has the power to shut down anybody for any reason that they imagine due to the effects on the economy, and that's basically what it's become, a fiat form of authoritarian government. So, empowering and direct the EPA survey states private organizations to collate all programs designed to promote renewable energy and adaptation. Renewable energy adaptation just hasn't worked out fantastically where it's been implemented. I've seen this especially with like the solar power initiatives. They don't really produce enough to make it a viable investment for the states that fund them. You get a huge amount of taxpayer resources poured into these private companies who build these windmills that don't produce as much energy as they're promised, and end up being far more defective than anticipated, and then you have to spend a ton of money on repairs, and the government has to continually come up with these subsidies in order to try to fund them, and it just kind of goes downhill from there. And that's particularly disappointing when you see this availability of nuclear energy that doesn't have any of those problems, produces electricity or energy for vastly cheaper amounts, and is overall safer. Particularly when you're talking about wildlife and the effect that windmills have on local bird populations. So, not a fan. Prioritize sustainable energy in urban development to take advantage of new material designs. Yeah, I see no problem as far as funding research, but again, the problem becomes with who's deciding what research to fund. If you're putting that in the hands of people like the EPA, then you end up with extremely political decisions being made, and so not necessarily a fan of that either. So, alright, well, let's get on to another issue. Let's see, reduce mass incarceration. I think this will be one that I can get on board with. So, America imprisons a higher percentage of its citizens than almost any other country in the world. Oh yeah, that is definitely true. We imprison ridiculously disproportionate percentages. However, I'm not sure if that takes into the official accounts of China or if that takes in the unofficial accounts of China. So China has a very worrying concern of mass incarceration of people based off of their religious or political ideology that is becoming increasingly worse over time. And they also have a semi-restricted incarceration program in which people are not allowed to leave the country. They're basically incarcerated within the country in a moratorium on their travel options. So, and I think that's like 25 million people allowed. No, that was when the program started. I think it's up to like 64 million people in China are not allowed to leave the country. Outside of my social policies, such as universal basic income, let's see, kind of describes the problem, mandatory minimum laws. I think that the mandatory minimum laws are pretty terrible. The research doesn't seem to support that those reduce crimes. People tend to commit crimes out of acts of passion or convenience, not in consideration to the consequences. And that's true for the most part, I think. There are crimes such as murder or rape or other things where I think people do consider the consequences. But for the most part, I think that they're mostly crimes of convenience and lack of conscience. So he says that his goals are to reduce the incarceration rates in America, increase the treatment of options for drug offenses, reduce the rate of recidivism, and reduce the overall crime rates. I would greatly like to see this. I'd like to see a drop in the number of people that we incarcerate, particularly for minor crimes. I don't think that we should be arresting people for speeding or for jaywalking or for drug use or for minor indiscretionate crimes that don't affect people other than themselves. So obviously, if you have a blatant violation, people driving 120 down the highway and at the risk of other people's safety or drunk driving, that sort of thing, then you have to take that into consideration. So he says, as president, how's he going to solve this? Work to end the use of private prison facilities and federal inmates. Totally support that. Shift drug policy away from punishment and more towards treatment. Very much support that. Invest money to fund innovative prison programs that decrease recidivism and increase reintegration. I think that the research is sketchy on that. I have to look more into that, but the things that I've heard are not great as far as the success with such programs thus far. So throwing more money at it should never be our first priority as far as problem solving. I think that we need to look at the research, we need to talk to experts, and then try to come up with new and better systems if these are failing. Invest money to support business and hire felons who have served their prison time. Invest money to support businesses that hire felons? No, absolutely not. You should not be spending money to try to influence the economy on who you think should be hired. That's kind of a form of identity politics almost, and it has all the same problems and none of its benefits. If somebody has a felony record, then they bear the consequences of that, and an employer should absolutely know about it, and they should be the ones making the decision if they want to hire that person or not based off of their need. You should not have the government trying to influence that decision with funding, taxpayer funding especially. Jesus. Push to reconsider harsh felony laws that prevent those who have served their prison time from reintegrating in society. Yeah, that's something we can take a look at. Identify nonviolent drug offenders for probation or for potential early release. Yeah, completely agree with that. Implement universal basic early release, like immediate. Implement universal basic income, which will dramatically decrease incentives for criminality and improve the functioning of individuals and communities. That goes back to the universal basic income program, which I'm not a fan of. So I support some of this, but certainly not all of it. This guy certainly seems to lean farther liberal left than I had hoped for thus far. So let's see what he says with the opioid crisis. This is something that I do know something a bit about. Approximately 115 Americans die each day from opioid overdose. The numbers are slightly higher than that from the statistics I've seen, but I'm not sure what all they're counting. Many more struggle through addiction, including all the negative healthcare I don't know. Let's just do the math on that real quick, because I believe it's 47,000 last year that died. So 128, yeah. 128 Americans a day. Many more struggle through the addiction, including all the negative health and behavioral impacts that entails. Nearly 220 million prescriptions for opioids were written in 2016. Many of those are fraudulent as well. You had the case where Telequia, where was that? Telequia, Kentucky or Idaho. They had a case where they were giving out like 126 pills, or distributing 126 pills for every man, woman, and child in the 13 counties surrounding it. Just ridiculous amounts of opioids being created and distributed for no reason. So despite the risk of these drugs were well known, 2.6 million are addicted to opioids. Outside the immediate health effects, drug trafficking related crimes have sprung up in communities throughout America in order to cater to these addictions, and our county's healthcare systems, complicit with the creation of crisis, hasn't found a way to treat the outbreak. The opioid crisis isn't just a nationwide public health emergency, it's a national crisis. I agree. But that was perpetrated primarily by pharmaceutical companies and a combination of published research journals along with the FDA approving these sort of things. So let's not minimize the government's hand in this problem. Tens of thousands of people are dying each year, with millions more suffering from addiction. Many of these people's addictions started when they were prescribed these medications by a doctor. The human suffering caused by the crisis cannot be measured. The economic damage is untold. We must do more to declare this crisis and hope the issue solves itself. Must do more than declare this crisis and hope the issue solves itself. Federal government, through the Department of Health and Human Resources, must find solutions to this emergency and coordinate with the states in its implementation. The CDC must use its expertise to quantify and combat this plague. The FDA must implement new steps to ensure that a similar crisis doesn't develop in the future. Most of all, we have found a treatment for we have to fund treatment for everyday Americans. No, just because you become an addict doesn't mean you have a right to treatment for your addiction. I can't just decide that I'm going to develop a problem and then say, well, it was my fault I developed a problem, so I'm going to blame the government for it and expect them to pay me for it. It doesn't work that way. Nothing wrong with allowing the government to permit states to ease restrictions in order to help fund or take care of this problem, but certainly not something the government should start just handing out money for. That tends to worsen the problem, not help it. While funding research solutions is something the federal government is good at, the funding research initiatives, the government is good at handing out money to people who want to look into things. Good job. Attaboy. The epidemic is affecting people on an individual level. Local governments will be much better able to experiment and implement solutions that will work for the communities. Couldn't agree more. The federal government, through funding and centralization, can help the work of the states and local communities in this crisis, but it should serve as a motivating and coordinating force in order to ensure that just means it wants authority over top of it. No, absolutely not. So the federal government should not be involved in this problem, other than just reducing the laws that prohibit states from helping individuals. States should solve this on a local level. You find a system that works in one place, and then other systems will adopt it. It's a terrible idea to try to give that power over to the government. Reduce the production of the use of opioids in general pain management. Provide treatment resources. Prevent similar crises from developing. Okay. As president, I will declare a state of emergency. Really? For addiction? Oh, come on. Seems a little extreme. Geez. Not liking the picture that this guy is painting of himself. He seems like a very authoritarian, top-down kind of leader, and that's not something that we want. We want regulations to be removed in order to allow bottom-up sort of coordination and cooperation to solve problems. So I would see massive increase in debt and legal regulations out the wazoo if this guy were elected. He would push for those sort of things, and we would see problems downstream from both of those. So yeah, not such a fan as of right now. Quadruple, really, quadruple. Yeah, okay. Fund federal funding from 4.5 to 20 billion per year and directed towards addiction treatment rehabilitation. And who's going to pay for that? Where is that money going to come from? No explanation here. Okay. Impose a new tax on opioid manufacturers to fund. Oh, so the people who need opioid medication are now going to be paying more for the people who got addicted. No, that's not a great solution. Retroactive to 2005, the drug companies will pay to treat conditions. The drug companies will charge those payments to the consumers, just meaning it's going to increase the amount that we all pay for pain medication. Wow, that is a terrible idea. The FDI should allow only doctors who complete specialized education in pain. Okay, so now the doctors are going to have to go through additional treatment from what they already know. Never been cited as a problem thus far. I don't think it's the fact that doctors aren't aware that patients become addicted. So it's going to require special treatment. It's going to be a pain for the doctors who are going to pass those on and increase costs to charge the visits. So healthcare costs will skyrocket underneath this problem, as well as taxes. All states should limit the size of prescriptions required for all opioid prescriptions to be made from the hospitals instead of individual office practices. Right now, our prescription rate is 4 times higher than that of Europe. We need to bring it down. Doctors need to tell more patients that they'll feel better on their own without having to take opioids. This comes from a unbelievably uninformed opinion that has obviously never experienced dealing with somebody who is in acute or chronic pain. Telling a patient that they can do it without the opioid, that they can do other things, is not a pleasant conversation to have with somebody who has come accustomed to being treated with opiates and pain relief that they receive from opioids. And you don't know who is an addict and who is not an addict starting out with pain treatment. So treating everybody as if they're addicts is not the way to go with this. We're going to get back into the same problems that we had with the development of this problem pre-1980 when patients were undertreated for pain because of the fear of addiction, and you're going to result with all sorts of terrible untreated chronic pain conditions from that. Not a great strategy. Direct the FDA regulation pharmaceutical companies' marketing tactics, such as they regulate the release of new drugs. No problem really with that. I think basically it should just be kept to honesty, informative, and educational. So depending on the regulations, that would be fine. Insurance companies should provide more oversight of prescriptions to curb abuse and report those measures to the Department of Health and Human Services. Really don't want insurance companies involved in my healthcare any more than they already are. They are not an independent. Yeah, absolutely not. This is an awful idea that's invasive to patient privacy and gives the insurance companies a role of power in which they should have no role. And governments like doing this because they can regulate insurance companies. Nobody's against regulating insurance companies. So basically the government weasels its way into your healthcare through the insurance companies. They empower the insurance companies in order to oversee this, and then they start putting down regulations on the insurance companies, and then the insurance companies are only too happy to comply with those because it means that they don't have to pay out as much and they increase their profits. That is the worst forms of healthcare that you could possibly imagine. Yeah, big negative there. Overdose patients should be sent to mandatory treatment centers for 3 days to convince them to seek long-term treatment. We're going to be mandating people from overdose treatment. Overdose patients should be sent to... So we're going to involve the legal system now when the patient overdoses. Doesn't seem like a very great problem, or a great solution to the problem. How are you going to enforce it? Somebody wants to kill themselves, how are you going to enforce that they go to this treatment? Now it's just one more burden and one more problem and one more societal stigma that they have in order to overdose again. Yeah, that's stupid. Work with the DEA to enforce much stricter limit on the number of opioid-based medications that can be produced in any given year and instruct manufacturers to report drug prescribed in each community so as to monitor, so increasing the role of the DEA, who has fought an abysmal war on drugs thus far. Giving more power to an incompetent branch of the government, just not a great idea. Destigmatize medication-based treatment options for opioid addiction, like sending them to mandatory treatment centers. Yeah, that'll work wonders, I'm sure. Do we need to do whatever it works best? Well, aren't you supposed to be explaining to us what your plan is for what works best? Including drugs that enable addictions to recover in stages. Wow. Oh gosh, here comes more local law enforcement. Okay, I think we're done here. So, the idea that this guy's an authoritarian hack, even though I like the fact that he lays out his positions. Very sad to see that he resorts to totalitarian, authoritarian measures in order to accomplish it. His solution basically seems to give lots and lots of power to government agencies and regulate the hell out of any sort of activity in order to try to solve it. And that has never worked well. So, probably won't be voting for this guy, but thought it interesting that he posted this. And I don't know, I'll probably like some of the things that he puts in. I would guess that I'd probably like the Every Cop Gets a Camera. I don't know. It was disappointing to go through and read that, because I had really high hopes that this guy would be more of a central leftist rather than a very far left-winged authoritarian leftist, and that just doesn't seem to be the case here. So, alright, well, I'll end it there. I hope that you guys enjoyed that, found it informative. I'd encourage you guys, if you're considering to vote for him, to go through and look through some of these, things that are of interest to you, maybe even some things that are not. Get a feel for the guy, and try to get a better understanding of where he is as far as his positions. Now, the one caveat I want to add to that is that, other members in the field don't really offer explanations for their positions. So if you're going to vote for them, take that into consideration, that you may be voting for somebody who holds the position you like, but if they don't explain the rationale behind it, or the reasons that they hold those views currently, or how they're going to proceed going forward solving them, you might not like any of that. Just as discussing here, I love the idea of combating the climate change, but it's why they hold those beliefs and how they're going to solve those problems that really matter, as far as giving them the power to act upon those problems. And people like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden, they mouth these platitudes, but they give you no explanation of how they're going to actually accomplish it, and they have no real background as far as their action that they've taken, the positions of power that they have already, to back up how they're going to solve those problems. So I'm very skeptical of those, and actually, if I had to vote somebody on the left, I would probably vote for Yang, simply because he does articulate his ideas and he explains them, and I can at least anticipate how he's going to go about solving them. Whereas with others, I mean, it's basically rolling the dice. So, anyways, I'll end it there, and give me some feedback. Tell me what you guys think. I hope you enjoyed it, and it was informative.